In the Buddha's Words, Anthology Review. Introduction about the Bhikkhu. Greetings, all you fearfully wonderful. I am Jomu. Why not join me on my New Year's resolution? A book list and reading challenge proposed by the great PewDiePie-sama, whose recent interest in topics of Eastern religion and ancient philosophy rubbed off on me. For February, we were introduced to Buddhism through In the Buddha's Words, an anthology, excerpts or suttas from the Pali Canon. This canon is preferred by Theravada Buddhism for their texts' relatively early proximity to the Buddha's time, which encourages a sense of primacy to their authority. The writer, Bhikkhu Bodhi, extracted some suttas of the Buddha from this version's 4 main collections called Nikayas. There was a lot of breadth of scope within his anthology that I had hardly any idea existing within Buddhist traditions, and that I would love to explore more of myself. Also, I didn't finish the book. I know! At around chapters 6 or 7, I became thoroughly overwhelmed. I mainly felt that the latter chapters required much more focus and perhaps even some memorization of more concepts. Also, a quick warning, this episode brushes on mortality, which may be a bit of a heavy topic, so center your hearts. Also remember that these productions do take a little bit of time. You can always show your support by liking, commenting, or subscribing. It aggregates the social media systems and lets me know I'm doing well. Part 1, Perpetual Impermanence. Chapters 1, The Human Condition, and Chapters 2, Vicissitudes of Life, focused on death and the posture taken in consideration of its slow approach. We all vaguely know of death as a slowly encroaching, humbling force, and the melancholy bound up with it. But the book also interested me in its insistence on why a force so unruly and negative would produce meekness or even encourage wholesomeness. Quote, "But monks, when an instructed noble disciple comes upon gain, he reflects on it thus. This gain that has come to me is impermanent, bound up with suffering, subject to change. And so he will reflect when loss and so forth come upon him. He understands all these things as they really are, and they do not engross his mind. Thus he will not be elated by gain and dejected by loss." End quote. This immediately sounds so sad, such a Debbie Downer attitude, but I believe the focus of this teaching was more on the freedom from variability and vicissitude, more than it is teaching indifference. It provides a firm girding for when death and loss do eventually slap us right across the face. And without worldview, these encroachments can be such agonizingly crippling thoughts. Forget humbling, they can reduce all exertion to a mere pulp that one wonders, why eat? That gap between the daily gaieties of those in prosperity and the thoughts, daily depressions, and stillness that accompanies those in grief are what often prompt the Nikayas, collections, to use strict vocabulary, like infatuation, to describe these mostly material concerns. Harsh, but the logic is that impermanence is ever present. A consistent and centered heart makes peace with when the impermanent ends or when it continues. Otherwise, pleasure can be seen as distraction. Is pleasure and pain overall complex seed bedding to the benefit of our offspring? I'm speaking from certain naturalist standpoints. A proper belief on pleasure-seeking, firm against the background of pain, is needed to replace what the Nikayas see as broad escapism. Quote, "These 8 worldly conditions, monks, keep the world turning round, and the world turns around these 8 worldly conditions. What 8? Gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain." End quote. For one, I really enjoyed this bleak categorization of the cyclicality of life. You can feel a sharp disillusionment towards all manner of problems, conflicts, and perhaps even greed and abuses stemmed mostly from these infatuations. And it makes sense. How much fluff can one make of themselves while reflecting on their failing body? We may use terms like out of touch regarding the presumptuous legislations of a politician or the profligacy of the rich, implicitly meaning that if only these royal sirs touched decay and frailty, then that would make them more acutely aware of whatever is the most pressing necessity as opposed to vanity and power drunkenness. Chapter 2 contains accounts that whittle down this drunkenness and hone in more precisely at the source, revealing to us an interesting link between blissful ignorance concerning death and selfish tendencies. One word of note to me was niggardliness. Partially because I am immature and giggled at an unfortunate naughty pun that you can make with this. I would rather retranslate this as stinginess, but also I found it had captivating nuance that touches upon the specific kind of selfishness being drawn upon here. Some stinginesses may arise from fair concerns. One may be motivated by concern for family, territory, but the key point is that those concerns can also burst out with terrible conflict and pain, not at all worthy of the simplicity of peace, negotiation, compromise, and coexistence. Quote, Sakka, ruler of the Devas, asked the Blessed One, "Beings wish to live without hate, harming, hostility, or enmity. They wish to live in peace, yet they live in hate, harming one another, hostile, and as enemies. By what fetters are they bound, sir, that they live in such a way?" The Blessed One said, "Ruler of the Devas, it is the bonds of envy and
stinginess
that bind beings." "But what, sir, gives rise to envy and
stinginess?
Envy and
Stinginess.
Ruler of the Devas, arise from liking and disliking." "What gives rise to liking and disliking?" "They arise, ruler of the Devas, from desire." "And what gives rise to desire?" "When the mind thinks about something, desire arises." "What gives rise to thinking?" "Thinking, ruler of the Devas, arises from elaborated perceptions and notions." End quote. Elaborated perceptions, fascinating. Brings to mind the phrase, taking something for granted. Would diplomacy, stalemates, and conflict resolutions more easily reach some compromise without elaborated perceptions from the opposing sides? Villainizing, terrorizing, oversimplifying, generalizing, neglecting, and condescending, all these miserable breeding grounds of omnidirectional hate. How does the pressure of mortality factor into this? Especially all the way up the ladder in the chain of command. I wonder if thoughts of pleasure, of family, and quietude would be more alacritous. It's an interesting thought what thoughts press into someone's mind based on their perceived circumstance. Anyways, these concern how death affects the stingy, envious elaborations. But what of wholesome elaborations of mortality? Wow. Let's say an injury visits you, crippling you to a near halt, and the day passes along with all your plans and dreams. Carpe diem my foot, LOL. I wouldn't dare say I have suffered in life. I'm grateful for my fortune. But I can relate to the dread of the stillness, perhaps some existential retrospection, some depressing thoughts, irrational beliefs on my self-worth, and then from there, somehow, I latch onto a word of encouragement. It's only a word, it may not last a while. But then I latch onto another truth. Perhaps I latch onto a task I can do. It's meager, barely anything, but I push myself on with tiny baby steps, thinking, what can I do now with whatever else I have? What is there to preoccupy myself with? You end up picking things to do because it simply is better to do than not to do. It's like a new sense of self-preservation, not instinctually but resolutely. And this is a neat, often very subtle point to draw on. The ordering of things than the disordering, to stack more blocks onto the tower. Why? Is this rational if one stacks a tower in spite of unforeseeable benefit? The Buddha catches on to this, and we're introduced to the Dharma, meaning phenomena, the objective, permanent, impersonal principle of order permeating all existence. Bhikkhu Bodhi says, the Dharma, in its broadest sense, is the eminent, invariable order of the universe, in which truth, lawful regularity, and virtue are inextricably merged. The cosmic Dharma is reflected in the human mind as the aspiration for truth, spiritual beauty, and goodness. It is expressed in human conduct as wholesome bodily, verbal, and mental action. End quote. So therefore, when death brings us to our lowest, when our eyes focus and see existence clearly, and it goes beyond humbling us to asking us to critically examine within ourselves, why eat of this? From that raw, lowest, lowly state of conscious existence, somehow comes more clearly this humility, this peaceability, this alignment. Quote, as aging and death are rolling in on you, what else should you do but live by the Dharma? Live righteously and do wholesome and meritorious deeds. End quote. The assumed default is good action. Keywords assumed default. I believe that this revelation and cosmic aspiration must be and is complemented with belief and purpose. I may take baby steps forward, but a greater perception and an object of faith gets me back on my feet, jogging. Whatever this goodness phenomena is that occurs uniquely in the human conscious, it's important to ask what to make of its connection to said conscious. Some, like me, may deify this benevolent principle, which then lays groundwork for seeing all of reality as tributaries of love effused from this wholesome dharma. A re-enchantment of the world, you could say. For the Buddhist, as we shall see, revelation of the Dharma, while also being full of love, still lays groundwork for a diminution and escape, an honest detection of misery and suffering as contradictory facets to the Dharma. The increasingly supernatural content within the Anthology is therefore a reflection of the light of this revelation, this enlightenment on existence, and the surprising links that craving has on reality. Part 2. The Dependency Faculty. One extremely arresting concept was in this exploration of the self. Quote, "The uninstructed worldling regards form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form." End quote. So for instance, my brain, my arm, my breath, my acts, my this, my that, mine, etc. Quote, "That form of his changes and alters. With the change and alteration of form, his consciousness becomes preoccupied with the change of form. Agitation and a constellation of mental states, born of preoccupation with the change of form, remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is frightened, distressed, and anxious, and through clinging he becomes agitated. He regards feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self." End quote. This tripped me up and scrambled me eggs. How ontologically horrific, how frightening, how anxiously distressing, what an agitating question. Is the consciousness self, or is it a function of self? It certainly serves me in the granted lucidity of awareness, of an ability to pause or resume the instinctual operations of my mind, thus making it seem as a function of self. However, if these unconscious instinctual operations are the providers of said attraction and repulsion through, for instance, memory, through feeling, through preference, through the senses, then what becomes of the reason behind pausing or resuming these operations? In what way am I preferring certain foods if you can reduce my experience to physical bodily operations, like the genetic makeup of my tongue combined with certain positive or negative neural associations of my brain? Do I say I like or my body likes? Am I hungry or does my tummy hurt? Is myself interchangeable with my body? Am I my brain? But then my environment would be me as well, no? So who am I? At least this is what I take the Buddha to mean, saying he regards feeling as self, volitional formations as self. An interesting assertion in light of, for example, the psychopath that we see dramatized in theater all the time. How much of the condition is their self, their personality, their core person? As I pondered this in perfect terror, I was introduced to why this thought process should even matter in the first place. Allow me to jump ahead to a famous teaching of the Buddha on dependent origination. And what, monks, is dependent origination? With ignorance as condition, volitional formations come to be. With volitional formations as condition, consciousness. With consciousness as condition, name and form. With name and form as condition, the 6 base senses. The 6 base senses, by the way, are sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, and mind. Continuing on, with the 6 base senses as condition, contact. With contact as condition, feeling. With feeling as condition, craving. With craving as condition, clinging. With clinging as condition, existence. With existence as condition, birth. With birth as condition, aging and death. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair come to be. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. This, monks, is called dependent origination. End quote. Again, this sounds so gloomy and feels close to self-loathing, but I do think, based on my reading, that there is some genuine heart and concern for humanity here, despite the yikes. Also notice the word ignorance matching with Saka's passage from earlier. The contradiction between ideal, virtue, peace and love, and war and hate were also traced back to ignorance and elaborated perceptions. This helps in showing us where the Buddha is extracting his principles and beliefs from. On this, Mr. Bodhi Bhikkhu writes, quote, "The Bodhisattva, in this particular instance it's just another word for the Buddha, continue, on the eve of his enlightenment, reflecting deeply upon the suffering of old age and death, then meticulously traces this suffering back to its conditions. The process of investigation culminates in the discovery of dependent origination, which thereby becomes the philosophical cornerstone of his teaching. It is important to emphasize that, as presented here, dependent origination does not signify a joyous celebration of the interconnectedness of all things, but a precise articulation of the conditional pattern in dependence upon which suffering arises and ceases. In the same text, the Buddha declares that he discovered the path to enlightenment only when he found the way to bring dependent origination to an end. It was thus the realization of the cessation of dependent origination, and not merely the discovery of its origination aspect, that precipitated the Buddha's enlightenment." End quote. This was why it was important to bring attention to the particularities of self. By making much of one's self, these dark realities are bound to happen. If I view my cravings and desires as expression of myself, as opposed to faculties that are actually opposed to my desire for peace and my intrinsic alignment to the Dharma, then in some level I bring about this same pain to the world. The truth of this deduction is validated through the stinginess and elaborations earlier teachings unpacked for us. That's what I believe the core argument is. Take note on this phrase, conditional pattern independence, referring to the Buddha's trace on how humans birth suffering. The Buddha speaks thus, quote, "Having thus given up likes and dislikes, he will be freed from birth, aging and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection and despair. He will be free from suffering, I say." End quote. When I first read this, my eyes naturally glazed over the extremity of given up. I thought this was just exaggerative language, a hyperbolic emphasis on how serious the bondage to preference, mindless lust for gratification, on how full obedience to primal instincts can wreak havoc upon the self, the family, and the land. This teaching and the need for control and the need for these instinctual base faculties to be brought under leash, I can agree with. The reason I brought up a passage from a latter chapter was to show that the freedom from suffering here is barely metaphorical, and I mean barely. The existential fear I felt examining his arguments of consciousness as non-self or form as non-self is being called out as one of these elaborated perceptions, although not as overt and evil. The stinginess also relates to this view on the body. The core argument here is on the perception of a self as a contrary precursor to destruction. I thought about it, and one term that seems most comprehensible to me is the dependency faculty. It's my attempt to preserve the fact that the Buddhists aren't calling for annihilationism, but rather an oddity or propensity to lose oneself in the bliss of liking or the escapisms of disliking. The point is to subjugate this particular kind of craving. Part 3. Righteous Shadows. Ignoring for the most part chapters 3 and 4 because of this script's length, chapters 5, The Way to a Fortunate Rebirth, and chapters 6, Deepening One's Perspective on the World, to my surprise clarified a substantial amount of supernatural content within the suttas I illy expected. It was very helpful for me learning the particular depths of Buddhist eschatology. Normally when I hear of an acquaintance or two taking inspiration from Buddhist principles and teachings, I always assumed that it was only focused on, well, the principles. that you extract and derive to fit into your own context. But I've found that quite a bit of the internal logic, at least from these anthologies' perspective, actually commends such sentiments as themselves subsets of Buddhist belief. Let's hear, for instance, Mr. Bodhi Bhikkhu's extrapolations on the famous concept of karma. Quote, according to the Buddha's teaching, the cosmos with its many realms of sentient existence is governed at all levels by immutable laws, physical, biological, psychological, and ethical. The process by which sentient beings migrate from one state of existence to another is likewise lawful. It is regulated by a law that works in two principal ways. First, it connects our actions with a particular realm of rebirth that corresponds to our actions. And second, it determines the relations between our actions and the quality of our experience within the particular realm into which we have been reborn. The governing factor in this process, the factor that makes the entire process a lawful one, is a force called karma. The word literally means action, but technically it refers to volitional action. As the Buddha says, it is volition, chaitun, that I call karma. For having willed, chatyutva, one acts by body, speech, and mind. Actions springing from the wholesome roots may be of two kinds, mundane and world-transcending. The mundane, lokya, wholesome actions have the potential to produce a fortunate rebirth and pleasant results within the round of rebirths. The world-transcending or supramundane, lokutera, wholesome actions, namely the karma generated by developing the Noble Eightfold Path and the other aids to enlightenment, lead to enlightenment and to liberation from the round of rebirths. This is the karma that dismantles the entire process of karmic causation. End quote. It feels obvious in hindsight, but I can better appreciate that far from being just a principle, lokya, or mundane righteousness, is an actual positive-facing facet of the cosmic samsara system. Samsara, meaning wandering, refers to the constant aches, rebirths, and deaths of creatures up and down the different cosmic tiers, with the higher tiers granting longer life, security, and wealth. Though even the highest attainable tier is not the ideal, hence why it's all referred to as mundane. Again, Bodhi Bhikkhu says, a Buddha understands and teaches not only the path leading to supreme state of ultimate liberation, the perfect bliss of nirvana, but also the paths leading to the various types of wholesome mundane happiness to which human beings aspire. A Buddha proclaims both a path of mundane enhancement that enables sentient beings to plant wholesome roots productive of happiness, peace, and security in the worldly dimensions of their lives, and a path of world transcendence to guide sentient beings to nirvana. End quote. So underpinning all this, we have a worldview of some fundamental laws of the universe that, as I understand it, pair positive volitional causality, basically good intentions, to negativity and the whole mass of suffering, as the Buddha put it above. And it's important to remember that these laws were discovered through conditional patterns of stinginess. He speaks thus, quote, "And what, monks, is dark and bright karma? Here, monks, someone generates both an afflictive volitional formation of body, speech, or mind, and a non-afflictive volitional formation of body, speech, or mind." End quote. To me, this refers to literally everyone. We afflict ourselves through hedonism, motivated or even enslaved to the immediacies of lust. However, through sacrifice, restraint, and what I would distinguish as higher order hedonism, we are not so much indifferent, though it certainly has that stoic flavor, but unshackled from dependency faculties. Thus, we have non-afflictive volitional formations. One distinction I appreciate and would absolutely adore to implement is between body and mind. Prior to this, I focused my hypothetical imagery on the person as a whole, which basically amounts to the mind, but I'm curious on any applications on the flesh trained against afflictions. I hadn't fully consciously thought to look at asceticism that way. The Blessed One continues, quote, "Having done so, that is, practice both afflictive and non-afflictive volitional body formations, continuing, he is reborn in a world that is both afflictive and non-afflictive. When he is reborn in such a world, he experiences both an afflictive feeling and a non-afflictive feeling, a mixture and conglomeration of pleasure and pain, as for example human beings and some devas and some in the lower world experience. This is called dark and bright karma." End quote. And this is the true profundity for me. Notice how affliction has been subtly shifted here. It is no longer only about principles of fortification against the cyclicality of pleasure and pain, but the cycles' response to fortification as the principle for fortification. Being afflictive births affliction. This reinforces just how problematic afflictive volitions are to this worldview. Aging and death are the result of afflictive folly. Pasts and futures unremembered are causes for suffering as much as selfishness is. I don't know if this revelation will hit you the same way, but it became super apparent to me that karma is not a wholly benevolent force. When someone says to one's deserved afflictions, haha, that's karma, it can be used beneficially to aid as a deterrent, keeping them from rebirth in the lower tier dimensions of heck, because it just so happens that karma responds that way to selfishness. However, I had never considered that the point was to destroy it. The Buddha continues, quote, "And what, monks, is karma that is neither dark nor bright, which leads to the destruction of karma, the volition to abandon this dark karma with dark results, and to abandon the bright karma with bright results, and to abandon the dark and bright karma. This is called the karma that is neither dark nor bright, which leads to the destruction of karma." End quote. Now that's perplexing. How can one develop in both non-afflictive and afflictive volitional formation? Well, I think it's just another variation on the messaging against dependency. However, where this gets interesting is in how much a layman or non-disciple can make of this. An unbeliever or a skeptic or a willing student may track with such teachings as relevant principles in their own lives, but the ultimate liberation, as Bhikkhu Bodhi put it, is another point worth exploring. Let's put a hold on that for now as we talk about fortunate rebirths. Now, another shocker for me on the topic of the supernatural was the existence of the devas, meaning gods. We actually met one early on. Saka, curious to learn about the origination of stinginess, I thought was just some passerby, but no, he's a full-on deity, referred to as the ruler of the devas, descending to the human realm from time to time to seek advice from the Buddha. On screen is a graphic here, I'll see if I can display graphics, of the three main spheres of existence that I appropriately depicted non-spherically, showing you the fathomless span of these worlds of cycles. My preliminary understanding is that we have a sense sphere where we, some devas and some sufferers in the lower dimensions of heck reside. Then we have the form sphere, the abode of the Brahmas, which are higher level deities that serve the great Brahma. Lastly, we have the formless realm, where only disembodied thoughts or mental states reside, and with the tippy top of the whole system being the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And while some devas possess roles in creation or guidance over the lower tiers, overall the uniqueness of this cosmology comes from all gods and spiritual beings being themselves creatures who age, die, ascend or descend. Even a human can transform into one such deva's spirit or afflicted ghost in some cases of descent. I wager they might be a quadrillion souls in these cycles. Quote, "If one who observes righteous conduct in accordance with the Dharma, should wish, oh, that on the breakup of the body after death may I be reborn in the company of the devas of the realm of the four great kings, in the company of the Tavutimsa devas, the Yama devas, the Tusita devas, the devas who delight in creating, the devas who wield power over others' creations, of Brahma's company, the devas of radiance, the devas of limited radiance. It is possible that on the breakup of the body, after death, he will be reborn in the company of the devas of the base of neither perception nor non-perception. Why is that? Because he observes righteous conduct in accordance with the Dharma." End quote. Pretty rad, pretty rad. But however, the realms are still cyclical, and what goes up must come... Well, here's the Buddha again. Quote, "Some person dwells pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with altruistic joy. Likewise the second quarter, the third and the fourth. Thus above, below, across and everywhere, and to all as to himself, he dwells, pervading the entire world with a mind imbued with altruistic joy. Vast, exalted, measureless, without hostility, without ill will. He relishes it, takes a liking to it, and is thrilled by it." If he is firm in it, resolves upon it, often dwells in it, and has not lost it when he dies, he is reborn in companionship with the devas of refulgent glory. The lifespan of those devas is 4 eons. The worldling remains there all his life, and when he has completed the entire lifespan of those devas, he goes to hell, to the animal realm, and to the domain of spirits. But the Blessed One's disciple remains there all his life, and when he has completed the entire lifespan of those devas, he attains final nirvana in that very same state of existence. This is the difference, the disparity, the distinction between the instructed noble disciple and the uninstructed worldling, that is with regard to destination and rebirth." End quote. Wowza! Massive downer. There's heck above as there is heck below. Here's yet another angle of karma being a certain gender of dog. You know the idiom I'm referring to. Once again, dependency is given a pretty harsh fate, not only in the human realm, but even in the realms of reward brought about by bright karma. Another aspect I'd like to focus on is on existential belief and how it affects destination. We've talked in brief of the form realm, but I think more fascinating for our purposes is the comparison to the formless realms at the tippy top of samsara. Jumping far ahead, the Blessed One speaks thus, quote, "He, the disciple, understands thus. If I were to direct this equanimity, so purified and bright, to the base of the infinity of space, to the base of the infinity of consciousness, to the base of nothingness, to the base of neither perception nor non-perception, and to develop my mind accordingly, then this equanimity of mine, supported by this base, clinging to it, would remain for a very long time. This would be conditioned." End quote. These are possibly the most terrifying realms in my imagination, and I think that's an important preoccupation. Can you imagine the base of the infinity of space? Horrific. Unsubscribe. The base of the infinity of consciousness? How frightening, how dreadful, how anxiously distressing. The imagery helps clarify my fears and hesitations of, let alone the formless realms, but possibly nirvana itself. The images in my mind are of slow suspension in an abyss, of screaming where no one can hear, of the irrelevance of my finitude in the infinite. I started to wonder if this is part of what formlessness entails, then this might help us formulate some more explorations on self explored in part 2 of this episode. The Buddha continues, quote, "He, the disciple, does not construct or generate any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence. Since he does not construct or generate any volition tending towards either existence or non-existence, he does not cling to anything in this world. Not clinging, he is not agitated. Not being agitated, he personally attains nirvana." End quote. Again, this sounds so coldly nihilistic, but I can better appreciate, at least to my reflections, that the difference between the meaning of existence between the formless devas and the devas of form is in this equanimity to the physicality of expression, hence their reward in the formless realms. Here's some more evidence, this time of an actual instance of attainment of those bases through intense meditation. We read, quote, "On another occasion, the Venerable Sariputta said, 'Here, friend, by completely transcending the base of the infinity of consciousness, aware that there is nothing, I entered and dwelled in the base of nothingness. Yet, friend, it did not occur to me I am attaining the base of nothingness. Here, friend, by completely transcending the base of nothingness, I entered and dwelled in the base of neither perception nor non-perception. Yet, friend, it did not occur to me I am attaining the base of neither perception nor non-perception." End quote. Venerable Sariputta here, who isn't dead by the way, draws focus on a key attribute between his perceptions of these realms with I am statements. Although I will say technically in the context, the point wasn't, ooh, let's attain the formless realms, but in pointing out that the true nature and final purpose of the meditative and disciplinary practices is in this same equanimity to aspects of the self, or the self as conventional wisdom might define it. Sometimes the book uses the word conceit to describe this. Yowzers! So things like I am not, this is mine, this isn't mine, I-making and mine-making ties everything back to the residual clinging to a view of self, which is why I speculated the way I did about how one obtains the formless realms upon rebirth. And dwelling on these fanciful imaginations of mine, because it caused me to examine how fundamental expression itself might be to my very being, can the two be meaningfully separate in definition? As touched upon before regarding semantics, could being be defined as an effect of sorts? The Buddha says that this thorough lack of agitation is the final attainment, but I am curious as to whether that itself may just be a definition of the self. Is this agitation, though the word is a little negative, the closest we can get to outlining the self? Part 4. Deathless. Death is technically transition in this cosmological model, and I imagine that would feel like a huge relief for all the sense spheres creatures to hear about. Wow, all these glorious creatures above, one would say. All these exciting, expansive realms of discovery, the endless heights of heaven. As touched on briefly above, nirvana is seen as a state of pure bliss and final release from the samsara, and its many cycles of rebirth, aging, and death. As these horrors roll in closer, a disillusionment takes place, or sometimes the word disenchantment is used, describing an elaborated perception of the infinity in all the vicissitudes of life. Assuming the eternity of someone held dear to you, the eternity of your body, breaking down and crumbling, the eternity of your person. Ideally then, a welcome solution would be to make these perceived infinities reality. And to tie up this podcast episode, we visit again the revelation of the Dharma. Here's the earlier part of the quote I nabbed from the Bhikkhu Bodhi. Quote, "The vast majority of people who encounter the Dharma are like the lotuses growing deep below the surface. These lotuses benefit from the sunlight and use its energy to sustain their life, yet still need time to reach the surface and blossom. So too the great multitude of people who hear the Buddha's teachings and establish faith must still nurture their wholesome qualities with the radiant energy of the Dharma before their mind streams become mature enough to attain direct realization. This process ordinarily requires many lives, and thus such people have to take a long-term approach to their spiritual development. While practicing the way to liberation, they must avoid a rebirth in the unfortunate realms and win successive rebirths, blessed with material security, happiness, and opportunities for further spiritual progress." End quote. Of particular note is this last part on how practicing for material security relates to this direct realization. It relates to something I read in chapter 3. Quote, "Do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by hearsay, by a collection of texts, by logic, by inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation, by the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by the seeming competence of a speaker, or because you think the ascetic is our teacher. But when you know for yourselves, these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are censured by the wise, these things, if undertaken and practiced, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them." What do you think, Kalamas? When greed, hatred, and delusion arise in a person, is it for his welfare or harm? For his harm, venerable sir. Kalamas, a person who is greedy, hating, and deluded, overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, his thoughts controlled by them, will destroy life, take what is not given, engage in sexual misconduct, and tell lies. He will also prompt others to do likewise. Will that conduce to his harm and suffering for a long time? Yes, venerable sir. End quote. So we can see here that it's not just training in bodily or spiritual aptitude, but there is an expectation here of the Dharma's empirical transparency. And so I pondered and photosynthesized on topics brought today under the confidence that the Buddha and Bhikkhu had in the Dharma's self-authenticating sunlight, and took, for instance, the principle of delayed gratification. Riffing on the bhikkhu's analogy, an immature lotus who makes a practice of producing mostly dark karma and a barren environment realizes in tandem with the warmth of the Dharma that it can achieve greater yields by withholding from the immediacy of certain outlets. Rather than simply reaching for and grabbing and squabbling for food, one tills the earth and waits, and through the partial cessation of self, blesses themselves, and even experiences a newer, fuller, transcendent self by finding new joyous fruits in blessing others through charity. This is important because the wanting is still eventually met, by which I mean touched, comforted by the newly introduced fruitful environment, the aforementioned bright karma. Therefore, wisdom pertaining to the perpetuation of life and prosperity through patience, long-suffering, and generosity are themselves revelations of this fearsome, awesome dharma. But also, wisdom pertaining to death is a revelation. What feels like pain is merely a threshold. What feels like a cessation of self is actually a truer, fuller application of what the lotus was trying to preserve in the first place. The irony is, through death, the deathless is obtained, which is just exalted magnificence, chef's kiss, beauteously kaleidoscopic. And remember, I'm not arguing that this extrapolation of mine is related to the Buddha's enlightenment, but if my current senses are to be trusted, I think it's a reasonable one in that it ties in the messaging of the book thus far. This simply makes sense to me, seeing that it underlies the logic of the diminution of the self, seeing self as conceit, the clinginess, the stinginess, and the agitation. But also notice there is a through line here between the immature lotus's comfort of a barren environment, as well as a mature lotus's comfort of a fruitful environment. For example, the book may use negative language like craving, implying a fluttering, perturbation, greed or lust, or a nuance of something excessive. But excessive how? Such qualities within the developing lotus are only as terminable as their negative impacts on the environment. The point has always been on the greatest yield, whether through dark karma or bright karma. A maximally fruitful environment is what I interpret by deathless. My, shall we say, quandary is to whether in all this uncomfortable severity, all this asceticism, reduction of form, there hasn't been an ever so subtle shift in application. It's hard for me to put into words because I really adore the messaging, the logic, the wisdom in self-denial, but the principle in itself serves to validate the developing lotus's want. The lotus's need to want, you could argue. There's a need to be touched and comforted by environment, but now it feels the messaging slightly looks down on touch as itself a precursor to a barren environment. And that's what I scrambled my brain towards trying to connect here. The reason we're here in the first place, photosynthesizing under dharma, is to maximize touch. Would you even allow me to call it righteous greed? Recall my thoughts on the boundless terrors of the formless realms and how I linked it back to a want of physical expression. In a sense, it may be that the environment defines the self, because without evidence or imprint, the self is unsatisfied. Can there be a being without some frame of sort, even a metaphysical one? Even the word formless forces associations of mostly loose yet discrete boundaries and separations. Heck, the word is defined by its opposite. How much worse is it then when I am no longer touched and comforted by these boundary lines? Or even if I am discomforted by the external pressure of boundary, at least the pressure substantiates me. I thought about this and I counter-argued that it may be that the systems of nirvana are repeats of what we in the samsara experience. Perhaps the messaging is in the temporary tucking in of our chests until we transition, and then we can unbuckle, returning to our former afflictive volitional body formations. But to me, this feels contrary. The issue would be the current system and not a problem of the creature itself. And if the system contains immutable, eternally inerrant laws that include morality as a pattern of them, which I believe the Buddha accurately and masterfully discerned in his reflections of this awesomely fearsome dharma, then our postures towards obtaining the deathless have to be congruous as well. Therefore, there must be that through line in both process and destination, meaning nirvana must be an environment suited for the perfectly equanimous, impercipient being. Which is well and good for them, but my struggle is to whether I can instinctually detect that jump, that shift, that recognition that, as the Buddha says above, when you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome, then you should abandon them. Again, assuming the point of wisdom is to maximize fruit, the possibly quadrillion souls within samsara must detect and capture that through line in the supermundane. If nirvana does not accommodate the quote-unquote greedy, as I've defined it, then instinctively creatures will be complacent with the hex of the samsara, just as, for example, we humans in this life may not be convinced to give up home life and pursue a monk-like life. We first discern the greater through line, an assuring promise that the boundless emptiness of this permanent space will touch us somehow, or that the warmth of nirvana's embrace will comfort the hardened, unfeeling boundaries that was once defined as the self. This was a profound and exciting read. It gave me new ways of looking at myself, particularly concerning myself, and how my spirit and action permeates every environment. It gave me a new look at asceticism as well as some clarities on the wisdom behind it. I apologize if the last section got a teensy weeny bit super duper abstract. It's part of the reason this script took so darn long to articulate, because I felt that the words of the Buddha have some heavy and tough, admirable and aspirational truths that are so close to my own heart and philosophies, but I just struggled to capture the discomforts, definitions and differences in a way that I thought would be helpful. Because again, I appreciated that the Buddha was all about balance, not the utter renouncement of felicity. He evidently had patience and compassion for those of us who he called householders, comfortable in the joys of marriage, food and drink and any number of gaieties. And ironically, that compassion is more evident in his gentle urgencies for firmer and more conscious grasps into these acts and daily human preoccupations, which has also been at the heart of my existential drive as a hedonist myself. To awaken to the revelation and meaning behind the cycles of pleasure and pain is a depth that I did not expect to find written here. Again, it's about the balance. The enlightenment is the balance. Regardless, I was thoroughly gladdened by this introduction to Buddhism. I would be curious to learn more from the other Nikayas, if I ever develop an afflictive enough volition or formation towards reading them. Thank you all for taking the time to stroll through the vicissitudes of my mind. I'll see you hopefully pretty soon with March's book for this monthly reading challenge. You can show your support by liking or subscribing to the channel to let me know if I'm doing good. May your karma, Chaitun, compel you.